I got out to a store and found a kiosk with the Splatoon Raiders Demo. So now instead of just giving uninformed first impressions of the demo footage they showed us in Nintendo Directs, I can give slightly better informed first impressions of a demo I played and got really bad video footage of. I've never been much of an IRL streamer or filmmaker or anything. I'm still using the same webcam I got back in 2019 for my streams, and the only video equipment I have is my phone. I went by myself, so I had no one to hold the camera while playing a game that very much requires two hands to play, even more than a Switch 1, because that Switch 2's heavier. The few shots I have of playing the game with both hands, I got by holding my phone between my chin and my chest. And I didn't do that very much because the kiosk was right on the edge of a central aisle of a public retail store I was in, and I looked silly. Another limitation is that the demo lasts 15 minutes. Unfortunately, a lot of that time is eaten up in spamming through dialogue and tutorial sections that'll take a while no matter how much you try to speedrun them. Because I was messing around with my phone trying to get footage on the first run, I actually ran out of time during the opening cutscene of the final sublayer of the demo, where you fight a thick-cut salty tongue. I took a break for a minute or two, looking around to make sure there wasn't some small adorable child waiting to play the demo that a grown man had been standing over for 15 minutes, before I fired it up a second time, blitzed through the early content, and made sure I had a chance to see everything. The demo consisted of three main gameplay sections. The first was an overworld exploration section, which served as the tutorial, very similar to the traditional single-player campaigns of the mainline Splatoon games. There are still enemies and even bosses up here, but the maps are meant to be traversed from one point to another. There are sections that consist only of platforming, and you can ignore combat except when you reach certain checkpoints that require you to beat enemies to progress. This gave you a lot of time and space to get used to the basic game mechanics, as well as to test out the different tanks and gadgets and see how they worked in low-stakes combat. This section introduces a couple different ways to launch yourself into the air, both these propeller-shaped plants and by jumping on the exploration bot. Raiders seems to be putting a lot more emphasis on airborne movement, and it does seem pretty advantageous to be up there out of range of most enemies, as long as you've got a build that can actually do anything from up there. It's not particularly helpful for most of the gadgets we had in the demo, though. There's also a new mechanic shown in the trailer footage where you surf from one island to the next. It's cool for one or two trips, but you're guided by pretty narrow, invisible walls with nothing to do but move left and right and jump. So aside from putting out some really easy rings to surf through, it wasn't very engaging yet, and you always ended up in exactly the same place. It's not like there were branching paths for that or anything. At the end of the first section, the exploration bot drills down into the ground and lets you play two sublayers, which work more like Salmon Run than mainline Splatoon single player. The first sublayer challenges you to collect a certain number of power eggs before a 120-second time limit runs out, and the second sublayer challenges you to beat a thick-cut salty tongue, one of the season's salmonid bosses that have already been shown in trailers. I beat the first sublayer with 52 seconds to spare on the first run and 62 seconds to spare on the second. Not especially challenging to someone with as many hours in Splatoon as I have, but it's easy to see how they could ratchet the challenge up, and I think it's totally appropriate for a game demo in a public store. The movement feels all but identical to Splatoon 3 movement. Squid rolling feels the same, Squid surging feels sluggish and situational as ever. It might be that they're just different graphics, or it might be that they've got some slightly different coding, because it felt just a little bit different in some way I can't put my finger on, but I could use my Splatoon 3 muscle memory perfectly fine with the single exception of sub-strafing. You don't actually have a sub-weapon separate from your gadgets, at least in the demo. The demo starts you off without any gadgets, just your main weapon, so pressing the bumper didn't do anything. It didn't cause that aiming animation, and therefore it couldn't interrupt your swimming animation. There are a few gadgets that do cause that animation. You can see it when I throw Booyah and when I drop a shot pot in the video footage. It's a relatively minor movement technique for PvE gameplay, especially since the addition of squid rolling, to the point where in Splatoon 3's Salmon Run, it's usually optimal to squid roll instead because of how the mechanics of filling your ink tank work. I'm not anticipating that dedicated players will miss it or complain about it that much. Still, it's something that threw me off a couple times, and if it's more useful and sought after in this game, there might be cause to pick certain gadgets to enable its use. Speaking of gadgets, the demo gives you the option to try any of the 3 tanks and to switch between them between sections. Speed comes with Blast Boot and Booyarang, Power comes with Splatchet and Splatolites, and Tactics comes with Shot Pot and Bomb Loons. I tried all the different tanks in combat at least once, though I ended up doing the most combat with the Power tank. My first impressions from the Raiders Splatfest video were uninformed by the amount of uptime each gadget has, and that significantly shifted some of them in my estimation. Splatolites, for example, looked pretty unimpressive from the direct footage, but as someone who had played the demo pointed out in the comments, and as I experienced when I played with them, one huge advantage of them is that they effectively don't have a cooldown. As soon as they're done, you just press the button and they're back out again. The extra damage over time is definitely noticeable. The same goes for Shot Pot. It's not a lot of damage compared to what the player can put out, but it is extra damage, and it stays out for a long time, so it's always helping to speed things up. Ironically, speed tank gadgets felt like they had the least uptime, and so I spent the longest time waiting for cooldowns using that build. I didn't get a ton of use out of Blast Boot, more because I just never felt so threatened as to press a panic button, but it did feel relatively safe when I flung it into a group of enemies to test whether it was putting me in more danger, and the burst damage cleared enough of what needed to be cleared to be worth even using it offensively. I'm also convinced that this was the only tank that would have saved me at one point in my first run. I had taken damage to the point that your movement speed is decreased, the way your armor breaks in the single-player campaigns of other mainline games, and I attempted a platforming challenge where I had to glide across a gap in that state. The glide was petering out, and I didn't have an updraft to keep me in the air, so the only way I made a safe landing on the other side was by using Blast Boot mid-air to close the distance. Booyarang is, as I expected, going to be a staple of this tank, giving the player a much-needed damage boost. The distance it moves forward before stopping and then returning to the player isn't that far, and I never had to fight that large of a horde of enemies, so the idea to Blast Boot away from it to make it travel further to return to you and increase its uptime didn't really amount to much in the demo. It seems situational. From what I played, I'd get the most damage by having it pass through the enemy on the way out, sit on the enemy as it holds in place, and then pass through the enemy again on the way back to me. Tactics tank held its own and felt thematically resonant in that it felt like picking it made you feel like a normal person with powerful tools instead of someone who had superpowers. Shot Pot was functionally very similar to Splatolites on the power tank, where whenever you don't have it up, you just pop it immediately so you have as much uptime as possible on your passive DPS buff. Bomb Loons were useful, but could be a little clumsy at times, and I'm skeptical about how well they'll scale unless they come with very high damage numbers. The main issue with Bomb Loons is that they slowly drift away from you after you deploy them, and even after you've deployed all of them, you still have to find one to shoot enough to detonate them all. That amount of setup works for Splatoon 2's Bubble Blower, which is presumably their inspiration, because in that game, the enemies you're fighting are firing shots at you, and the bubbles blocked those shots. In this game, though, the enemies are mostly melee range, or put out AoE damage, both of which would go through anyway. I didn't encounter any enemies that fired shots, so I couldn't even test to see if they would have blocked them. What can happen, even if you only have the base level Bomb Loons, so you only have 2 to deploy, is that by the time you've deployed all of them, they've floated behind the enemies you're targeting, so now, to detonate them, you have to shoot through an enemy or two before your shots will reach them to blow them up. The problem would only get worse the more you upgrade the gadget to unlock extra nodes. This doesn't necessarily make them useless or anything. It is still a relatively high damage explosion that you can set off on a pretty short cooldown and will go off at multiple points at the same time. I'm sure as time goes on, people will also figure out how to mitigate its downsides. The question becomes whether its limitations are worth putting up with in comparison to something as universally useful as power tank gadgets. Splatolites, like I said, were a lot more solid than I had thought initially, and noticeably improved my DPS. You spend a lot of time walking and shooting when you're trying to clear waves of enemies, so that gives them plenty of time to get down enough paint for you. They passively and reliably deal with weaker enemies behind and to the side of you, so you can focus your fire on bigger, tougher things instead of having to turn to paint for yourself, which is increasing your overall DPS by itself. Splatchit also just shreds bosses, and it comes up quickly enough that you can use it on most of the bosses you encounter. Between those two gadgets, I was clearing enemy areas noticeably faster and hitting higher damage numbers than with the other two tanks. There were times when it took me a second to realize when my main weapon was out of ink, because it felt like I was still doing significant damage between the Splatolites and the Splatchit, and my feet were still getting painted. The one time I got to reach the final sublayer, Power Tank was the one I decided to take into it. One potential downside I could see with the Power Tank is that both gadgets incentivize you to get closer to the Salmonids, and getting closer to the Salmonids is of course more dangerous than shooting them from further away. There will probably be a mix of options at other ranges, like the Shellacker, that exploding charger-looking thing from the trailers, so maybe it was just this mix of gadgets, but if the enemy density ever gets so high that your main weapon and Splatolites get overwhelmed, this playstyle could have an upper limit for playability. Then again, I'm not sure that lower uptime or lower damage gadgets are going to feel any better in that situation. We'll just have to see how the other options feel. If you're at all familiar with Salmon Run, nothing's going to feel all that unfamiliar, but there are some new enemy types I'll mention briefly. Salivators, these vulture-looking things, don't actually seem to attack you directly, but instead launch these yellowish whirlwinds that do damage over time to anyone inside them. Functionally, they're a lot like Drizzlers, except the rain doesn't move. Also, when you attack the core of the whirlwind, it not only stops the whirlwind, but also becomes an updraft you can ride. This could be one of those bosses that experienced players may choose to keep around instead of splatting right away if they want to take advantage of that utility. That said, I think the most damage I took throughout the demo was due to those whirlwinds, not because they were so hard to avoid or take out, but because in the heat of everything, it was easy not to notice I was taking damage in the first place, and the visual cue that you are taking damage is a lot more subtle. More than once I had to check my health bar to see if it had even gone down or not.
Here comes the boy.
Salty Tongues are basically just slightly bigger lessers. No special weak spot or gimmick. They just move forward toward you and have a lot of health. Splatchit seemed to one-shot them, though I didn't go out of my way to isolate other sources of damage and 100% confirm that. The thick-cut Salty Tongue by itself was pretty easy to manage, and the only reason that sublayer was challenging was just because it brought friends with it. Still, with Splatolites active, most of the time, I was just dumping all the main weapon shots I had into it, and spamming my Splatchit into it as soon as it came off cooldown. Splatolites painted around me while I focused on damage, so strafing around it to avoid the killer whales was trivial. It does have a lot of health though, so if they ever throw more than one of those bosses at a single player at the same time, it's going to get a lot more chaotic. The difficulty ceiling of this game is basically as high as the devs feel like pushing it, and given that Triumvirate exists, that's probably going to be pretty high. Dude, who got a bit more time with a more complete version of the game, I'll link his video in the description, remarked that he was impressed at how difficult they made the higher difficulty, so while finishing the demo wasn't too tough for me, I'm sure there will be some challenges that will give even Salmon Run veterans something to sink their teeth into. You can definitely go try it for yourself, too. It's at a lot of Best Buys, Targets, whatever retail place where you might find a Nintendo section. Not every place has the kiosk, but it wasn't hard for me to find either. Raiders drops next Saturday, so there won't be much more of a wait till we get our hands on it to see it for ourselves. In the meantime, if you're watching the day that this comes out, I'll be busy with Land of 10,000 Lakes, the Minnesota local. Stop by our live streams on Twitch or YouTube to see me playing and hear me casting.